Hi. When Gauch asked me to come here and talk about something relating music and the media in my own experience, I thought what better than to talk about what I've been doing for the last 40 years. So today I'm going to talk about why I started to use the computer to compose and to generate sound, and how I've done it. So I've also mentioned, I think I didn't look at the Portuguese translation, but I don't know whether it says there that I will also, I must say, I didn't read through the whole thing, whether it says that I'll talk about those programs that I wrote which I used multiple times. Because I've written many, many programs for one-time use only, for one composition, and never used again. The program did its job, gave me a score, and that was the piece, that was it. But there are a number of programs that I have been able to use on many occasions. Now, why did I start to use the computer? You also have it in the text there, but I will say it in my own words now, so directly. I had this idea for a composition back in 1970. It was actually given to me as a task by my professor of composition, Bernd Alois Zimmermann, at the Music University of Cologne. Unfortunately, he died in that year, in 1970, and never managed to hear the result of what he asked me to do. But for a long time, I was stuck on the piece. He actually gave me the task of writing a piece for cello, trombone, vibraphone, and percussion in '69 already, and I was going very slow. I wrote the first part of it, I think, maybe already at the beginning of 1970 when he was seriously ill. And so he never got to see the piece, and that's one of my big regrets. I wonder what he would have said. But part 5, it turned out to be a 6-part piece finally, lasting about 20 minutes. And part number 5, I realized I wanted to have the cello starting on a very low note, its lowest note, the C, repeatedly. And then gradually introducing the D flat and then back again to C only, but then more D flats. And then after the D flat, a D, and then an E flat very gradually. So you can see I'm already now describing a process. The process says that the bottom note remains the same, that the top note would gradually rise, and I decided that would be half a period of a sine curve. So gradually the top note would rise and reach a certain higher note, which was going to be the F, 3.5 octaves higher. And the number of, the probability of the notes from the lowest to the highest would not be equal. Some note in the middle would be the most frequent, and they would taper off so that the bottom note and the highest note would be the least frequent of all, and that was going to be determined by a kind of parabolic curve. So I had all the mathematical tools to generate this music. At the very beginning, I tried to actually write it out of my head, and I found I couldn't, because I would say, how many C's do I write before the first D flat comes in? And then how many C's again, and then how many D flats? So it had to be a process, and I said, okay, I've got to grasp this problem using mathematics. So I wrote out all the algebraic formulae that I needed to generate this, and I then thought, how can I generate it now? So I thought, okay, in those days there were no pocket calculators. So I bought myself, what I had from school, a logarithmic table book, and I threw dice and tossed coins and tried to work it out that way, calculating the probability of every note for every point of time using the logarithmic tables, trying to do that. But I found it was going to be so difficult, and it says so in the Portuguese text, it would take me 6 months of hard work to do 3 minutes of music, working the whole day, every day. And I wasn't up to it. I thought this cannot be done. And one morning, when I woke up and was lying in bed, deciding not to get up yet, my mind wandered, and I thought, hey, wait a minute, this can be solved maybe by a computer. So to cut a long story short, I learned programming in the language Fortran, and had my piece within 1 week of starting the course, because it was so easy to program. It's just easy, you know, like you have do loops and you have go-to statements and all of that kind of thing. And I didn't need very much code to be able to write the piece. So within 1 week, I had all my notes chosen by a random generator using the probabilities, and I had to then translate it into notation. But that took me another week or two maximum. I had a score which was then done. And the process starts with this cello C, and then you have the trombone coming in an octave higher a little bit later on the C above the cello C, and then you have the vibraphone coming in on middle C, and they all end on that same high F. So it's not my intention to describe that piece in detail, but that's how I got started. And once I started, I couldn't stop. Somehow I realized my brain was always going to be turning back to the computer, even though I didn't really look forward to it, because I knew working with the computer is very boring work. But ideas kept coming up in my head all the time, which caused me to again use the computer. One such idea was used in a composition called text music, which I came up with in 1971. I had this idea, that was the first piece I wrote, which took me away from serialism. Now let me tell you a little bit about my musical history. I started to compose when I was 11, inspired by the school orchestra, because I played in the orchestra, I was a piano player, and so I decided to make pieces of my own. And when I was 13, my pieces became serious, and I began to notate them for the first time. The first notated piece, and I have the score in Santa Barbara still, is a piece for organ in A minor. And so I kept writing these pieces more or less in a mid-19th century style. But then when I was 15, I became really serious and went back to Mozart, Haydn. And that's the kind of music I was writing then. String quartets, piano sonatas. And gradually I found my style advancing through the late 18th into the 19th century. And by the time I was about 17, I reached the end of the 19th century and was writing pieces in the style of Rachmaninoff. And a little later, when I was 19, I was writing pieces in the style of Prokofiev, Hindemith, Bartók. And at some point, I reached serialism and was writing parametric, almost parametric pieces in which I had these series in rhythm, series in in pitch. And this piece, text music, which was called text music as well, was the first piece in which I thought of something totally different. I thought of writing a piece for piano in which none of the musical ideas would be strictly musical ideas. They would come from everyday life. I would be using terms like long and short, terms like loud and soft, or for the piano, so I'll be talking about terms like black, white, and doesn't matter, or mixed. I'll be talking about depressing the right pedal or not, stuff like that. So all of these terms were written down finally in the form of an instruction text, filling one page. And then I began to make pieces based on that. So first I made these pieces by hand. Well, I think my very first version was even done by the computer. I wrote a program which I called TXMS. Here I wrote the full name, text music. And here is a chart for version 4 showing you the different parameters and the distribution. Let's look, for instance, at loud and soft. This curve implies that at the very beginning of the piece, 50% of the events are going to be loud and 50% are going to be soft. And as the curve rises to the top, it's 100% loud at this point. And then the curve, which is actually mainly straight lines, comes down to here where it's 40% loud and 60% soft, all determined by probabilistic calculations. So you can understand the short and long, and you can understand the depressed and the released. This one's a little more complicated. The syntax, you can see it at the beginning it's 100% letters. And then at this point, the number of letters, single notes in other words, begins to decrease. And over here, the probability of syllables increases, so that at this point, just before this line here on the left, it would be 70% syllables and 30% letters. You understand what I mean? The choice would distribute the text in that fashion. So for 30% of the time, you would have single letters, single notes, and then you'd have syllables being small chords. So you play all notes of a syllable at the same time, and that would be a chord. And then I moved to the level of words, and I put in an extra rule there. if the event would have more than one syllable, then I would repeat that as many times as the number of syllables in that event. So if a word has 3 syllables, you would hear the full word as a chord being played 3 times. But the durations of these 3 could be different. It could be long, short, and long again by chance, or all 3 long, or all 3 short, or whatever. So all of that was written in a Fortran program, which I then used to generate version 1 in 1971. And I premiered the piece on stage. I still used to play the piano in those days. And it was then played in Darmstadt at the summer courses in 1972. It lasts 20 minutes, version 1. And people were so annoyed by this music because the chords were not based on any form of musical grammar. They were simply the allocation of notes on the keyboard. By the way, I allocated the notes of the text starting at the very first letter to the notes of the keyboard, somewhere in the middle. So let's take an example. Suppose I say, take a text as a text. And then I take the letter T and I put it somewhere in the middle, let's say on the note D. Then I would write the letter, or allocate the letter A to the note next to it. It could be a C or it could be an E. Then the K would be on the other side of the D. So it could be D, C, E, B, F, as being the letters of the text. Now if I say take a text, when the letter T comes the second time, or the letter A comes the second time, it is not allocated. I just drop it until I have, taking the English alphabet, 26 keys maximum allocated to letters of the text. So it will be T, A, K, E, and the A will be dropped, and the T will be dropped, E will be dropped, but the X will then come in there, and the next T would be dropped again. So this way, all the letters of the text are on the white keys, and then they're all, again, on the black keys, done in the same fashion, and then they're all chromatic. Now, a musician would say diatonic, pentatonic, and chromatic, but I didn't write that in that text, in the instruction text. It just said black keys, white keys, and mixed keys. So this program generated music according to that principle. Some versions of text music were made by hand. Some were made by other people. In all cases, by hand. No, except for about 2 or 3 people who asked me to use my program. And they got a chart like this from me, and they drew their own parameters. And I put them into the program and output the piece and gave them the notation. So that's the way this piece was generated in several cases. This was version 4, based on the instruction text, the very text that I used to explain how to make the piece. Version 1 was the same thing, but in Darmstadt, when Herbert Henk played the piece, it took 20 minutes to play, and people were so annoyed at this music with some very tonal chords, just at random, they just happened to be there. Some of them clusters, some of them very tonal. Once, in one case, when Herbert was playing a C and an F, some wise guys began to whistle an A to complete an F major triad. So the applause and the booing lasted another 20 minutes after the piece was over, because that was not Darmstadt style in those days. They wanted something totally serial. So here's an example, a very short example of version 6, and here you can see the allocation of the text. This is by Samuel Beckett, all known, all white, bare white body, fixed 1 yard, legs joined, and so on and so on. This is from the text called Ping. And here you see the allocation. A, L, second L is dropped, K from the known, N from the known, O, W, second N is dropped, and so on. Or at least that's the only, wait a sec, where is the N? I don't even see it. No, here it is, known. So the second N at the end of known is dropped. And then you have W is dropped from the white because it's there already. So all the keys in this example, on this screen, can be seen here on the left. And I'm going to play, played by MIDI, just a bit from here to here. And you can see long notes, short notes. There are also loud notes and soft notes. I don't see the dynamics in this score, but they should be. But let's listen. So this is Windows 7, and the last time I tried to do it, I had to wait about almost a minute until it got its act together. So let's see if that happens. I thought the program had crashed, but it obviously hadn't. So this particular version lasts, I thought, 80 minutes. And for a long time, it was not played because of that, because of it lasting 80 minutes. Let me see if I can, you see the mouse is moving, once again. Definitely not Darmstadt. And this piece, when it was first played by a pianist in Cologne many years later, about 9 years later, it wasn't 80 minutes, but it turned out to be almost 2 hours. And then I asked the pianist to give the notes time, to let the long notes just breathe. And then it settled down to 3 3/4 hours finally. It was played by 3 other pianists in different places without me instructing them at all. And it turned out to have exactly the same length. And in all these performances, I provided mattresses in the hall in which the piano was, had pizza and red wine outside, so people could always go out and have a little piece of pizza and come in again. And displayed in all kinds of places like Berlin, Budapest, Stockholm, and so on, and I think about 15 different cities in the 80s, until, well, nobody wanted to play it again. So that's text music version 6. The shortest version is text music version 10, which lasts only 2 minutes, and it's for 2 pianos. Well, to show you one more little graph, I made one version based on a Cologne dialect text. I had to leave Cologne for 1.5 years, and I felt already nostalgic before I even left. This text was written by a Cologne poet, and it says, "When I think of you, Cologne, and see the cathedral standing in front of me, I want to go back on foot at once," and so on. It's a very sentimental text in Cologne dialect, which is very much like Dutch. And you can see the parameters in the chart are all taken from picture postcards of Cologne. So here's the cathedral, and here's the church of St. Martin Major. Here is St. Garion's church. Here is the West Gate. Here is again the cathedral and the Hohenzollern Bridge, and this is the Opera House. So all these parameters are taken from picture postcards, and the text was taken from this very sentimental, patriotic poem. Any questions? Because I'll move on now to the next program that I'm talking about today. And that is a program called the Synthroumentator. Synthroumentator means synthesis through instrumentation. Sometime in the early 80s, 81 to be more precise, I had the idea that I would like to instrumentate speech, so that if you heard the instruments playing the notes on their music stands, you might be able to understand words. So how did I do that? I took text, did a Fourier analysis of it, and every Fourier window, you must know what I'm talking about, turned out to be a chord. But now sometimes you would have had too much disturbance because of all these chords one after the other. So I did a thing called calming. I took something which I call the velocity tolerance, and I try various values, so that if, for instance, I say 4, and all the velocities, I convert a Fourier window to a MIDI chord, and the amplitude now becomes velocity. And if one window and the next window, they will now be velocity multiples of 4. So all velocities will be 4, 8, 16, and so on. And now my system is, if one partial of the Fourier analysis, which is now a note, has the same velocity as the one in the next window, then the note off and the note on will be removed, and the note will be calmed. It will be continued, prolonged, for as long as the velocity doesn't change to 8 or down to 0 or something like that. So this calming process, I could set a very high velocity tolerance, in which case the file becomes very small, because lots of note offs and note ons are then cancelled. But then in such a case, you may not get a differentiated result. But if I keep a low velocity tolerance, it becomes too disturbed and untidy. You have too many chord repetitions. So the clue is to find what is the best velocity tolerance. And the program's instrumentator allows me to set the tolerance and listen to the result. So here is an example where I took the German words in Armenian, which means in Armenia. That's part of a longer sentence. And this converted to a MIDI file and calmed, instrumentated, sounds like this. So if you listen carefully, I'll play it again. In Armenian. The Armenian becomes very clear. And I don't use the R as a R sound in German. It's just Armenian, because you can speak German like that. You can drop all the R's in such a case. So in Armenian, you can hear that once again. And this is the same thing played by an ensemble. So the sentence goes on, in Armenian, ein Jahr lang erinnern. For this piece, I went through a German dictionary, all the way through, and found 200 words which consisted of synthesizable words. In other words, no plosives, and so on, no fricatives, only nasals, laterals, and vowels. And tried to make meaningful sentences out of these words. So the sentence in Armenian, ein Jahr lang, in Armenian, ein Jahr lang erinnern, it starts an null Männer in Armenien ein Jahr lang erinnern, which means now let's think of cleaning personnel in Armenia for the duration of 1 year. So all these sentences that I made are completely nonsensical, but they mean something in German. I made a total of about 12 sentences, which are then instrumentated, and that forms the score. And you can see this here, this is exactly what you just heard. So it is instrumentated Fourier analysis. Here's another example. For a large orchestra piece, I took this time only 3 short English phrases. Why me? No money, my way. The piece is a very critical piece about the whole system of giving composers commissions to write pieces of new music and then expecting them to write music that the commissioner will like. I obviously went opposite to that. I knew that when I would write a piece for a commission, in this particular case of this orchestra piece, that they would never give me another commission after that. I knew that. Because I was not going to write the type of music that they expected for that festival. So this whole piece is about commissioning. And so you can see the sonograms up here, the analysis. Why me? You can see the E. No goes down here. No money. And again the E. My way. That's the end of that. And these sonograms now converted to MIDI files by instrumentation sound like this. This is a score. I just called this particular technique in that piece Orc Talk, from Orchestra Talk. And this is what you'll hear now on the synthesizer, and then the orchestra itself. Why me? No money, my way. The no money is particularly clear. So when this piece was being recorded in the production studios, the technician once spoke through the mic to his conductor and said, "Oh, please, could you do that again? I couldn't understand a word." And the orchestra knew what this was about, but they just played the notes they had. They didn't know which was which at what point. They might have been able to understand it in the orchestra at that particular point. So this piece was another case where I used instrumentation. And I've used it on a number of occasions. For instance, they asked me to write a piece, a kind of fanfare together with other colleagues in The Hague to celebrate 175 years of the Royal Conservatoire. So what I did was, I took a text, which happened to be the first line of the Dutch national anthem. Wilhelmus van Nassau ben ik van Duitse bloed. And I took that, and I slowed it down tremendously and instrumentated it, and that was my entire contribution, just this one line, stretched to 90 seconds. And all my colleagues, they knew my music was usually very rhythmic or whatever, and they were totally amazed at this strange music, and it's very boring. I'm going to spare you that music today. I'm just relating an anecdote. And it was performed in the big hall. I was out of the Netherlands, so I didn't experience the performance. But when I came back, I got a recording of the performance. It was for brass ensemble and percussion. And then I took it home, and I sped it up. Actually, I got the entire fanfare, including the other composers' contributions too. And I sped it up 16 times, and I could hear my part very clearly as the melody and the text of that first line of the Dutch national anthem. Now, the Queen was also in the performance, and she must have got totally bored by my part as well. If she's got any good taste, she would have been bored. And I then took the sped up version to a composition exam where we were sitting together, 5 plus the director of the school, looking at scores of applicants, and we had a 10-minute break at one point, and I said, guys, may I play this for you? This is our fanfare. Oh, you got a recording? I said, yeah, I did, but I know we don't have time, so I'm going to play it 16 times faster. And they said, oh. So there it comes up, they're listening, Louis Andriessen's first part of it sounded very strange, and then my bit was the second part, and all their jaws dropped because they all recognized the anthem. I said, this is what you heard, but only now 16 times faster. So that is instrumentation. Any questions? Oh, by the way, I should tell you one more thing. A student of mine in Santa Barbara has now written this instrumentation program. He took not my code, but he was instructed by me. He wrote it in C++ on the Mac. So I'm going to work with him a little bit to clean it up a little and make the user interface a little more intuitive. And then I'll be happy to send it to Carlos at any point when it is done. So you could all have it and use it. You put in a WAV file, and it outputs a MIDI file with instrumentated results, which you can then score. And one of my students, a composition student in Santa Barbara, has already used it in 2 of his compositions. One time I helped him with my own Linux program, so I wrote it on the Atari many years ago. First of all, I wrote it in Fortran in 1984. Then I rewrote it in Pascal on the Atari. Then I rewrote it in Pascal and Linux. And now my student's written it in C++ on the Mac. So I'm hoping that sometime it'll be available. Pretty soon, actually, next year I'm thinking. So, Autobusk. It's a program I came up with in 1978. 75, I was sitting in a bus in Turkey, and I thought of a piano piece, a big virtuosic piano piece that I wanted to write. And I was inspired by Turkish music to write a piece with quarter tones in it for piano. Now, if you write a piece with quarter tones for violin, people might think the violinist is not very good. Or for trombone, any instrument which you can tune microtonally, people would think, oh, he didn't know how to play in tune. But on a piano, you have to believe it, particularly if all 3 strings for any one note are all tuned to the same pitch. So I did a lot of calculations, and I realized that this piece would contain variable tonality and variable metricism, among other parameters. So here is my Atari screenshot. It took me 14 years to complete the program, although I was able to use it already in 3 months when I first wrote it. The reason why I wrote Autobusk is because I was commissioned to write a piece for the International Computer Music Conference, ICMC, in The Hague in '86. Now, I composed my own piece, the big piano piece called Cholo Autobesichlitmesi, in '78, using a whole batch of Fortran programs. So there are about 20 different Fortran programs, and they processed the output of the previous program, and so on and so on and so on, until I finally had a piano score. The score itself, I notated using pencils from the computer output, which was only numbers. And so what I did there was, I took 1 year approximately to write that score. I calculated that I spent 2,000 hours notating the score with a pencil. And the pianist took 6 months to learn it, again Herbert Henk, and then he played it in Darmstadt. This time there were not so many boos, And I even got a prize for it, so it must have gone wrong somewhere. And this is an example of a piece I wrote in '86 for the ICMC. It's called Variazioni e un pianoforte meccanico. And if you take every fifth letter, V-A-N, and so on, it says van Polten in Dutch, which means from the pause, meaning the piano, played on the piano, or from potentiometers, which means faders. So parameters, in other words. And here are the main parameters. You can read them while you're listening to this music. This is near the end of the piece. It lasts about 25 minutes. I don't know why the inventors of PowerPoint, particularly here, always think the mouse has to disappear. Now an explosion. Second explosion. So this entire piece is composed parametrically. All the parameters are in a file, but the result is probabilistic. It's the result of probabilistic calculations. So every time I run the piece through this program, Autobusk, it comes out sounding very slightly different. But if you don't know the notes exactly, you will think it's exactly the same piece. So this is where in German the words dasselbe and das Gleiche have different meanings. Das Gleiche means the same type, but dasselbe means identically the same. So the notes are not identical from one version to the other, but they sound almost the same. So I'm composing what you could call the gestalt of the piece, and the program generates the notes. So this is the case of Variazioni. I'll move on to Auto de Blue, which I will play completely. It's a 4-minute piece using 17-tone equal temperament, also on a player piano, just like Variazioni. It's also a player piano piece. And you will hear it's based on a blues structure. So you probably heard how the scale, the 70-tone equal, dividing the octave into 17 equal parts, resembles the blues scale, and I was able to use it in that fashion. And also the 17-tone equal has very good fifths, so I was able to use the 1, 4, and 5 chords, which are used in blues very easily. This program can be downloaded. It's too complicated to port to the Mac or the PC at the moment. It runs only on the Atari, but it can be downloaded from a website. Just Google it simply, and you can get it for free. You get the manual for free as well. And if you have a Windows emulator, you can get an Atari emulator for Windows and run the Windows emulator on the Mac if you have to have a Mac. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the emulator. And we got it to work on Boot Camp and on Hatari. So these are two things out there on the internet. We managed to, my whole class now has Autobus running on their Macs. So that's quite a good thing. And I don't think that in the near future, unless one takes about 6 months of heavy programming, that I could convert this or anybody else. I've made 3 attempts to get people to actually port it, and they all gave up. One person even took the money and went away, and that didn't get me anything. So there is another thing. If you make a note, just take out your pens and write DJ Stir, called DJ Stir is a bit like digester, because one of the principles in this piece is called indigestibility. Not the piece, but the idea, the program. So DJ Stir from Georg Heidu in Hamburg. You can download that, and that runs very much like Autobus. It's almost the same thing with a different user interface. So he was a former student of mine, professor over there of media and music, and he'd done a great job. So that would also work. But I like Autobus Classic. This is my version, and you can see I slaved over it, over all the graphics. And these are all my own graphics. I didn't use any toolkit at all. Made my own graphics, and here you can see Cologne Cathedral and the 3 crosses of Amsterdam, because I was always moving between these 2 cities. But I also did a lot of programming on this piece in Canada, in the US, Japan, Australia, all over the world even. I kept writing, and I got a huge log of where I did what to the program over those 14 years. I finally declared it finished in 2000. So the next program, Tupletizer. You know what a tuplet is? A quintuplet, a triplet, sextuplet. This program attempts to rationalize irrational values and make them notatable, so that if performed by musicians, you would get these irrational values correct. Now take the case of an accelerando, where you see that here. This is a screenshot from Linux. If you look at these little vertical lines from left to right and then from top to bottom, they form an accelerando, a real geometrical accelerando in which every time interval is multiplied by a certain constant factor to speed up the tempo. So you know the typical poor man's accelerando, which is a monoplet, a duplet, a triplet, a quadruplet, a quintuplet. People write that and they get so bored. 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, and so on. So I tell my students, no, I'll help you. So for things like that, this program can notate in regular notation. Now, the notation can sometimes be very complex, as in this case. This is for solo piano, believe it or not. And it's in 4 layers, and you can see all the different couplets. But for the pianist, I also provided a MIDI file, sound of a MIDI file, in other words. And she could then listen to that and try to imitate what she could read by listening and then playing. And I also gave her a graphics score, so that might help. So this is the beginning and the end of that piece called Or a Cherished Bard, which I wrote for Deborah Richards. The title is an anagram of her name. This is MIDI because it's more accurate than her playing, actually. This is the beginning of the piece, very simple. That's a whole tone scale, and gradually I will bring in the other whole tone scale on the other side, so it'll sound chromatic, and at the end it moves entirely to this whole tone scale. Now the middle. Sounding vaguely like Boulez. piece. The piece is supposed to take about 8 minutes in all, and the pianist Deborah Richards at the premiere took 20. She managed to get it down finally. It's an extremely difficult piece. She managed to get it down to 14, which was quite good actually. But the MIDI version gives you the piece as is, as it were. I actually wrote this program, Tupletizer, for a piano concerto that I completed in 1998. Here you can see an accelerando in the brass, while the woodwinds accelerate and decelerate, and the brass are again accelerating. It's got parallel accelerations and decelerations shifted. So how to notate that? So that's why I wrote the program. The input is a table of durations. It could be a MIDI file. And the output at present is a table of notations showing you which kind of tuplet and which notes in the tuplet. The way it does it is, as you saw in the screenshot, I have little boxes of equal duration. And in each box are certain events. And then I take the rhythm in each box. Let me go back to that. You see these boxes, which are, in this case, they all have vertical separations, but if they had a different duration to that, then these lines would not be vertical. They would be staggered. So each of these represents unit time, and you can see the time down here as 1,000 milliseconds. So each box here lasts 1 second. And I take that rhythm and compare it with all possible rhythms with the same number of attacks, notatable. I mean, all notatable rhythms with the same number of attacks. Let's suppose I have 3 attacks. They could be in one box of time. Now I take all possible rhythms using duplets, triplets. So my duplets would be on, nothing, or nothing, on. In other words, let's say note, rest. My triplets could be note, rest, 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 note, rest, 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 note, 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 rest, note, rest, note, note, rest, note, note, and so on, like bits. So every possible notatable rhythm in a given tuplet, duplets, triplets, quadruplets, quintuplets, in this case up to 14 tuplets, as one would say, but I suppose one would call that what would it be called? Decimal would be 10. What would Latin be for 14? Think of whatever the word would be, but in any case 14 beats. I say un deciplet and duodeciplet for 12s. I suppose it would be, I don't want to now speculate. So the program then takes the file and tries to find out the rhythm which comes closest to it. The error, it can be seen down here in the length of pixels, usually tends to be about 20 milliseconds if you've got it right. It could be 20 milliseconds off, either too early or too late in the notation. Now in my piano concerto, I'll show you another example. Here you see the brass and the woodwinds again, with other instruments playing at the same time. The musician said, "Why are these rhythms so complicated?" I said, "I'm sorry, but you know, that comes out of my algorithm." I didn't want to tell them, "Oh, but you will do it correctly," because the musicians, in their attempt to play these notes as correctly as possible, didn't play them correctly and smoothed them out a little bit, which made them perfect. So they have these very complex looking rhythms with some notes too early and some notes too late, according to the original acceleration, but they smoothed it out. So listen to the result, to a short excerpt. Because musicians were not playing totally accurately. So all the inaccuracies in my notation were smoothed out. So that's tupletizer. And my final program I'm going to talk about is ISIS, intra-sampler interpolating sinusoids. I didn't put that on the screen, but that's the meaning of ISIS, inter-sampler interpolating sinusoids. What's all that about? Sometime in the late 1960s, I would begin to think white noise is the sum of all frequencies. How can that be? Because if it has all frequencies, it'll have an infinite number of frequencies, and that means each would have to have an amplitude of 0. Otherwise, the sum of the amplitudes would be infinite. So that doesn't make sense. So I asked the technician in the studio in Cologne, I said, does white noise contain 1000 hertz? He said, yes. I said, how about 1001 hertz? That would be contained too. Then I said, what about 1000.5? And he had to think. Now he's a technician, he studied all that, sound engineer. And he said, not sure. So sometime in the 70s, I decided for myself that white noise was one single sine tone moving to all possible frequencies at very high speed. And I tried to generate things like that, but in those days technology wasn't easy. So when MIDI came around, I wrote my first MIDI programs. You know, MIDI can send out a maximum technically of 600 notes a second, but actually synthesizers can't handle more than 200. So I did what I called spectricization, in other words, spectral stochastic. So stochastic, yeah, spectastic actually. Spectacization comes from spec and stochastic, so spectastics. So my spectastics technique generates values according to a spectrum. So you take a spectrum of a given sound, it could be any sound, and you have this curve, and the curve following the envelope will be now the probability of the note at any given time. So if you want, you could even have just one spectrum for every single note. You could have, say, 50 notes a second, so 50 spectra a second. And every spectrum would be a probability curve now, and the notes would be generated in that fashion. Worked out very well. I could take human speech, spectastize it, I keep saying that wrong, spectastize it, and it will come out sounding like the speech. As a matter of fact, there's a program which ran in 1994 with a baritone singing into a microphone. His sounds with words, they were all cut into a text, were analyzed, Fourier analyzed in real time, and converted to a spectastic melody, which was then played on a player piano. And you can actually hear what he's saying in real time. The latency was very small. You can hear what he's saying or singing played by the piano accompanying him at the same time. And you can hear a similarity between the two in the timbre. So I'm going to actually now, let me show you the technique again. Here are 7 samples, totally random samples, but only 7. If you do a Fourier analysis of these 7 samples, you will get a very strange spectrum. It will be 0 kilohertz, 6 1/4, 12 1/2, 17 3/4 kilohertz. And that's all you get. These are the amplitudes. Not very useful. But this is what you can do in ISIS. So here are the samples again. You can see them as these little dots. And between every pair of samples, you see a sine fragment. And here's another sine fragment. And these are the frequencies of the sine fragments. These figures here are the phase in degrees. This is called contigual phasing, because the phase of this particular fragment at this point is the same as the phase of this fragment, of the next one. So I keep the phase constant between one little time window and the next. So this is going to mean 44,000 notes a second. And it turns out, now suppose all samples were 0, every sine fragment would be 44 kilohertz, because you'd have one sample and one sample at the same value, and you'd have one period at 1/44,000th, the time gap between one sample and the next, a second. So an ISIS melody comes out with 44,000 notes a second, and the values are all around 44 kilohertz. Let's take this example. This is Morton Subotnick saying, "Left alone at the turn of the century."
left alone the dirt of the century.
That was the result of an interview I did with him in '99. I went around the world and interviewed 20 different composers and asked them the same two questions. I said, what do you as a composer think of the 20th century? And the second question is, what do you as a composer think of the 21st century? So various people gave me various answers. Curtis Rhodes' answer was saying, the 20th century is very much like this. And then he was silent for 2 minutes. And he just heard the sounds of clattering. We were sitting in a cafe. And after that he said, the 21st century is more like this. The same thing. And so Martin Subotnick was saying, in the mid-20th century, there we were marching ahead and we had so many people following us. We were the avant-garde and they were totally amazed by what we were doing. And at the end of the century, we turned around and they're all gone. We were left alone at the turn of the century. So that's why he said that. Now what I do is, you can see here the analysis. This is the actual analysis in cent values, in deviations from 44.1 kilohertz. So this is the mean, and these are the deviations. And wherever the sound is louder, the frequency deviation tends to be more. But that's not the case in the entire wave. There are cases where you will find a big cent deviation, but the original wave, and this is the reconstructed wave, have slightly different values. You will see deviations between the two, a certain similarity. Now, the original wave, I was able to reconstruct. So what you do is, you take what I call the SIS, which is sustained interval sequence, because some of these values can be repeated a number of times, one after the other, the same frequency. So then you write down the sustenance count, how many times that frequency is valid. So if you take that table, which looks like this is the exact tabulated values, which you can see over here, and it's minus 0.98 of a cent, minus 48 of a cent, plus 0.48 of a cent. These are the values given by the analysis, the ISIS analysis, of the sound wave. And they're depicted here graphically. Now if you use the reverse formula, you can see the formula is the difference between the arc sines of two successive samples divided by 2 pi, and then that whole thing taken as a log and divided by the log of 2. And that is the interval in octaves. So of course multiply by 1200 and you get the cent values. So that particular value, you can take the inverse formula and reconvert it into a sound wave, and what you will get is something indistinguishable from the original. But why would I want to do that? I want to use the ISIS melody as a melody, but it's too high and too fast for me to hear. As a matter of fact, I say it's a bit like aliasing. You take a Beethoven symphony, analyze it algorithmically through ISIS, and you get a table. Now this melody is what is really, I like to say, in a Lewis Carroll kind of way, is really the melody, but we hear it as a Beethoven symphony because of aliasing. So it's false. The melody itself is the correct thing. So, but I want to hear it. So I can transpose it down several octaves. I can slow it down by sustaining each frequency. So for instance, if instead of having 44,000 notes a second, I want to have only 11 notes a second, I sustain each value 4,000 times. And it becomes into a sine tone 1/11th of a second long. And it's microtonal. Look at the histogram here. Very small divergences from 0 semitones. So I can stretch that. So I have 3 parameters in ISIS, 3 main parameters. One is shift, one is spread, and one is slide. So in shift, I stretch it. I transpose it. In spread, I stretch it in intervallic values. And in slide, I can move it from one transposition to another. So these 3, that's another, I shouldn't say slide, because I do slide it. I should say sustain, of course. Shift, spread, and sustain. These are my 3 main parameters. So forget that I said slide, please. Sustain. And I can sustain things very long, and I can shift them down several octaves, and I can stretch them several times. So here's an example of Martin Subotnick's voice, that very same ISIS example, transposed down 7 octaves to about 300 hertz. stretched 100 times, and sustained 4,000 times. And in the course of the short 20-second example, I then bring all the parameter values back to the original. So I raise the whole thing, I slide it up 7 octaves, I squash it down to no stretch, and I speed it up from 4,000 times slower to the original speed, 44,000 notes a second. And this is what it sounds like. Be prepared to put your fingers in your ears if it's too loud for you, but I don't think it will be at all. So this is Mod Subotnick, transformed and then brought back to the original smoothly. Here too, there is a Max program, not Max, sorry, there is a Max program, but there is a Mac program as well, which I just need to clean up a little bit with my students, written in C++, which does, so there are actually 3 programs. There are 2 written in Max, and 1 written on the Mac in C++, which allows you to even use faders for these 3 parameters. So if you put them all at the original configuration, you hear the original sound file, but then you can begin to stretch the melody or sustain it or shift it, and you begin to hear something like that waterfall. Now, there was a lecture I gave, and there is a Super Collider version as well, written by one of my students. And I gave a lecture once in Cologne, and my student and we sat together and had a kind of discussion on stage. He explained the program, I explained ISIS, and we played a little example where I played a Bach Prelude No. 1 actually, on a MIDI keyboard, and he did all kinds of transformations at the same time. And we had 2 little bottles of champagne on the stage, because this music is very bubbly when you make it go up to that stage. And I actually gave it a title, Mundus ist Mensch. So, sound words. And I pronounced it in German very quickly, which could also be Portuguese, Munch Mensch. So it's extremely squashed. And the title is spelled in German, Munch Mensch. So I'm not going to play that, but I'll play you a piece of mine called 4 ISIS Studies, which were actually 4 different pieces that I also edited to form one piece. It lasts 4 minutes, and I'm going to play it completely. The first one is based on a little 2-minute lecture on ISIS in German, in which my voice is transformed into ISIS, into the bubbly sounds. And at the end, it reconstructs my voice. At the beginning, you hear my voice as an original file there, but you gradually fade it out. So it's gone for good. I don't bring it back using the volume. It's reconstructed using ISIS. The second one is based on a very famous speech. You will recognize it. The third one is based on a creaking door in the men's toilet in the Berlin Public Library. The ICMC 2000 was held in Berlin, and lots of things happened at the library, and the visiting delegates were totally thrilled at the sound of that door. So they recorded it, and about, I think, 15 composers wrote pieces based on that creaking door and slamming door. I didn't know about that, but I made this 3rd study later based on that very recording. And the 4th one is based on an English sentence, "This is not a work of art." And the title of that 4th one, the title of the first one is called Für Gimmick, Vortrag über Haiku, which means for Gimmick, which is the society I founded in Cologne for computer music in the mid-80s. So it means for Gimmick, lecture on haiku, on ISIS, not haiku, ISIS. The second one is called 11 Steps in Staying a Kingly Dream. You will know why the title is like that when you hear it. The third one is called, what is it called? It's based on the creaky door, but I've forgotten the title at the moment. And the 4th one is called Ceci n'est pas une œuvre d'art, which means this is not a work of art, which is what you actually hear. Spoken by a program called Ambrola, which you can download from Belgium, and it does very good speech simulation. It's free, you can get it just down, MBROLA, a great program. And I cut those syllables, this is not a work of art, into a number of little fragments the izzy, snot, cough, fart. And these little fragments are moved around freely in time, and at the beginning they're all in different places, and at the end they all come together and you hear, this is not a work of art. And it's based on a harmonization of my intonation. I said, this is not a work of art. And taking that intonation, I found the pitches and wrote a little chorale. So it turns out to be that chorale at the end. So 4 minutes, and then we're done. Die Methode ist es. Die Methode ist es. You can hear the similarity to my voice at that point. Here's my voice coming back. So already study number 2.
This nation will rise up, live out the truth. We hold these self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream. That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and former slave owners, will they be able to go down? I have a dream.
Number 3. It's called it's called Untitled Oil on Metal, Wood. Or the lack thereof. Study number 4. Thank you. I think we have probably 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, sure. Any questions?
Yes.
Small. In one of the first pieces showed the curves before the ones with the curves coming from the landscape of the monuments.
Oh yes, right. Yes.
The one previous one, how did you find these curves that actually?
Oh, these are completely composed. Let's start here and go there, and then just draw from here to here. It's totally arbitrary, totally spontaneous. So one could do it algorithmically too, but in that case it was certainly just intuition. The composer composing the parameters like Schubert would compose a song. Same way. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question. So what I find amazing about all the work you presented here is this permanent search for new ways of expressing things musically. And my question would be: do you think that this has led, at least in your life, to create a different language or a very specific language? Because what you showed here is very different things, and they seem to a point very complete. But then, sometimes the music seems that it's like all over the place. And my question is, with all this experience, I mean, has this led you to create some sort of unified theory or something that has to do with new composition techniques and stuff like that?
Not really. It's the pieces that actually drive me to do these various things. The pieces are kind of my commanders. They present themselves, and then I have to find a way to make them. I've never been interested in a personal style. The reason why some people say, oh, but you can tell it's Barlow, that's because I'm limited. I can't go further than a certain amount. I don't intend at all to have a red thread going through all my work. Stockhausen once asked me, isn't it great to look at your entire work and to know it's all done by you? I said, no, every piece I write is like the first time I've ever composed. That's how I feel. And I'm not at all interested in the personal style. And when my students, whether in The Hague or in Cologne or in Santa Barbara, tell me, I really would love to develop a personal style. I said, well, that'll be our downfall, because you'll be limiting yourself. You should write the music that wants to come out of you, and not think of yourself. I say, your work is more important than you.
Well, that's very apparent in your music, I think. That's you have all these experiences, and they all sound very, very different.
Yeah, right.
So I don't know. I would agree with you. Probably there's not a Barlow style. I mean, you can. There's certain. I think in between the notes, there's traces of things that you can relate to you, but you need to know you. I think there's a lot of humor in your music, and that goes throughout. I mean, even in these Heises, there's some, these snippets, these things that happen that are very humorous. What are you going to do next?
I'm supposed to write a piece for organ to be premiered in Cologne on November 16th, and I have not the slightest idea what I'm going to do. I know that won't be a piece that will be exploiting rhythm and melody. I'm thinking of timbre, because it's a very rich sounding organ with all kinds of, it's a pipe organ driven by MIDI. And so I'm going to have to think of combinations of different timbres and see what they will do. So at the moment I have no idea, and I'm hoping to start working it when I go back to Santa Barbara sometime later this month. I have some very boring things to do first for the campus, and after that I'm hoping, maybe in August, to start work on that piece.
Question.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you've been in the most of the history of electronic music, especially with computers, and a big thread of live electronic music has to do with live processing and
Yeah.
interactive systems, and it seems that you put that strength of your work, and I wonder why.
You mean that I don't use processing?
No, like live processing, or I don't know any.
Well, I have also done other things. There is a piece of, it's a program actually called Papagai, and I don't know if you know the meaning of that word because it's German, but I think there are other languages which have it as well. It's, let me get this right, it means parrot in German. But it's just, yeah. And, but the words, the letters P-A-P-A-G-E-I mean parametric algorithmic patch bay accompanist for the generation of events through improvisation. And what that program does is it listens to a musician playing in real time. It was performed by a flutist, and that goes into the program and generates flute sounds taken from samples of the flutist. And there are ways of patching it. So if, for instance, the flutist plays, I'm just improvising right now, if the flutist plays very fast, the computer will maybe play very tonal music. It uses aspects of Autobusk. It'll play very tonal music. If the flutist plays very loud, it'll be very metric. If the flutist plays very regular rhythms, it may become louder. So there are all these parameters you can patch, the input and the output parameters. And I did that because I felt inclined, I was interested in that. But it's not my thing to say, oh, I must use processing. I've never used Macs in my life. And I'm not interested, I'm interested in a piece or in a process. So if the process demands that, as in the case of, the piece is called Resonancia Flautomatica. And so that piece, I felt I needed to do that, so I did it. But I don't do it often. Usually it's complete work that's presented at the end. And very recently, I came up with a piece called Songbird's Hour in 2011, which was a total accident. You remember the transformed version of Morten Subotnick's voice? I was trying to generate that in Linux Pascal. So I had written it on the Atari, and I was trying to just port it to Linux. And something went wrong with my program, and the computer kept on and on and on, and I just said, well, I won't interrupt it, I'll just see what happens. And it took ages, and when it was finally done, there was a 1-hour sound file on my disk. And it starts off, it's a very, very busy little twittering bird, and gradually gets slower and slower, and the bird gets more and more depressed, as it were, and the sounds get more and more cracked. And then there are gaps, sudden silences, 10 minutes of nothing. So I recently played it in the courtyard. I liked it, so I kept it as a piece and gave it a title. And I played it recently in the courtyard of the music building in Santa Barbara, at UCSB. And we listened to it outside. I played it on a little mono dictation device, which I hid in the bushes. And we just stood over there and we could hear every single sound because some of the silences were so long. You could hear all the planes. It was a very Cajun experience. You could hear planes, you could hear other birds. And then suddenly it would begin to twitter again and then stop. So that's something which is also a piece, but that really was not intended to be composed. So all kinds of stuff happens to me. Yes, please.
Hi, Clarence.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you again.
Great to see you.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
The second question depends on the first one.
Yeah, okay.
Do you know a German young composer called, I think, Jonas Kreidler?
You know, I think I've seen the name. I don't know personally, no.
But you know his work?
No, not at all.
No, so
Not at all.
I don't know the second question.
Okay. I must say my job keeps me from getting to know people's music.
Well, my provocation actually was because this young composer,
Yeah.
it's similar. his attitude is similar to your attitude.
Oh, nice to know.
In
I mean,
terms-
not that I believe people should agree with me, but I'd like to meet him someday then.
In terms of both works have a lot of fun,
Yeah,
humor.
Okay.
It's a very interesting characteristic.
How old is he?
I appreciate very much in the musical world.
How old is he?
Very young, maybe less than 30.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'll keep my ears.
Very interesting composer.
Thank you.
Has
Mhm.
a real attitude.
Thank you. You had a question?
Yes. When music arrives in you, in your mind, do you think that you hear it, you see it, or you speak it to yourself?
All of the above. Sometimes I think of an algorithm. I try out the result. And if I like it, I keep it, or I change the algorithm. Sometimes I actually hear the sound, but I don't hear it in every detail. So I try to get to that I'm hearing and generate that somehow. Sometimes I even compose spontaneously. For certain dramaturgical reasons, then I'll go to the piano and write a piece in the old-fashioned way. Not often, but I still do that.
So you try as a process?
Yeah. The piece is the one that tells me, make me live. And then I try to find ways. So, yeah, it's quite different from piece to piece. I have, for instance, pieces that I've been thinking about for years. It's a piece which I wanted to write in the 80s and I still haven't written. It's for extended vocal technique choir, maybe about 16 musicians. And the text I wrote then in Middle English, and it's about the conductor, and it's called His Fine Manner of Working. I know exactly how the piece will begin. I know how it will go on, even. Not every detail of every particular place, but I know what I want to put into it. I'd love to write that piece if I knew a choir that would be willing to learn it. I would need, Mongolian types of singing and whistling and all that kind of stuff at the same time. It will start with, imitating a brass sound with your lips, like imitating a brass instrument. And it will go on for about 5 minutes like that with the choir sounding like a brass choir. And that would be a take on Perrotin, who said Cedron Principes. It starts, and it goes on for ages with just say. So this will be the beginning of my text, but just the W of the first word of the text. And that would be the brass thing. And suddenly, the first word is one. So it'll start, which means when. It'll start with this brass sound, and suddenly after 5 minutes it'll open up like Perrotin into one, so people don't know why the choir is imitating a brass choir, but then that's because the text says so. So that's an idea I've had now for over 20 years, nearly 30, and I still haven't written the piece. So, to give you an example. So I think we're probably running out of time. Yeah. Oui.
What do you think of 20th century music?
Okay. At the end of the broadcast that I made for Cologne Radio with those interviews, the producer asked me, so what do you think of the 20th century as a composer? And I said, well, and this was not recorded, not broadcast. I just said it off the hook informally, but I can say it openly. I would divide the 20th century into 6 equal parts of about 16 years each. Now, what kind of grading system do you have in Portugal? Do you have 1 to 10, where 10 is the best? 20, okay. So I would say the beginning of the 20th century, the first 16 years, I would give a 20. The next quarter, I would give a 15. The next sixth. The next sixth, I will give a 10. The next sixth, so after the 50s, in the 50s, I would give a 15. Then I would give it a 10, then I would give it a 5. The last 1/6, I will give a 5. That's how I would grade the 20th century.
What about the 21st?
The 21st, you see, a great thing is I even wrote an article to the effect. I also wrote a very sardonic and very sarcastic article about a fictitious guy called Barlow Clarifier, a professor, who analyzed 800 works of the 20th century, which is not true. And he analyzed them according to 3 criteria: mastery, originality, and integrity. and drew curves for all these different sections. And you see Stockhausen in his early life, very masterful, very original, very integral. And gradually the integrity, the mastery, and the originality all go down towards the end of his life. So all of these, and he was my teacher, so people, my students say, can we be very rude about you? I said, go for it, just simply do that too. So my point is, but this is now really not being sarcastic, and I'm being completely true about it. See, my theory also outlines this, which I put in inverted commas as a kind of fiction. There were great composers who emerged after the end of the Second World War, because music had been kept totally, all creative music had been suppressed. So these people now came out of the woodwork and were able to write really great stuff. So Stockhausen, Boulez, Ligeti, Koenig, and all those people. And they got very rich in the process. So the second generation helped them to get rich by assisting them. Johannes Fritsch and other people. They were always at their beck and call and doing things for them, doing all the technology, patching the wires and all that kind of stuff. So these guys are very modest, and they earn their money through teaching. They were mainly teachers and very serious about their teaching too. The third generation was looking at the first generation saying, wow, famous guys, I'd like to be famous like that. So the third generation was only into money and just wanted to have a great career. And the fourth generation had forgotten the first generation, and these are people who are now in their, around about 30. And these people knew the third generation firsthand and said, what's all this music? Why is it so bad? Because the third generation stopped asking questions about quality. It was no longer how, it was no longer why, it was now how. How can I get a commission? And the fourth generation was too young to be getting commissions, but was filled with all this bad music. And so I wrote an article, a more serious article recently, saying times have changed. And I find that my students in the 80s, I can forget. But my students in the mid-90s to now are so much better that I'm really happy to be teaching them, happy to be sitting with them. And this was true in Cologne, also in The Hague, and now in Santa Barbara. So I feel times have really improved, and I'm looking forward to better stuff coming from that generation. Not from the older ones, but from that young generation. So, detailed answer. Yeah?
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please.
Well, you wrote all of your programs you wrote, and you code them. And, well,
Except for Papagei, I gave a commission to a student to write that, and now more recently students are taking my algorithms and making programs as well. So yeah, but otherwise yes, I did all the coding myself. First in Fortran, then in Pascal, and now I'm writing a little C. So yeah.
But how do you think, well, nowadays there are each day new software coming up to make music, and most of the software with ready-made functions and well, all
You know,
sorts of help.
I use little editing programs, like there was a program called Cool Edit Pro on the PC. There is one called Spear on the Mac and the PC. I haven't used that yet, but I wrote a program to help my students to take Spear output and convert it to what they wanted. So I've often written software for my students to help them with their composition. So these are such cases. But basically, I only use a handful of programs. Sibelius, Cool Edit Pro. I can't think offhand of anything else. I'm not interested, because the music that I imagine cannot be done by most of the programs on the market.
Yeah, that was my question. You had to write your own software to
Yeah.
make your own music. So how do you feel all of this software that's with ready-made functions help or doesn't help?
Well, it depends on how creative the musician is or the composer is who's using them. If the composer just says, which button should I press, and that's all the composer wants to do, then I'm not interested in even helping that composer in any way. But if the composer comes to me with an idea, I might say, oh, maybe you should look at Max. You could probably do it in that. I've told students to learn Max. I never learned it, but I've told them to use it. Basically, for students I say, okay, if the music is interesting, if they really want to do something interesting, fine. But if they want an easy way out, simply to just make a piece and go and play it somewhere, then I'm not terribly interested in that approach.
Yeah, but in the 70s, most of your colleagues and you were thinking that now people will be writing their own software composers would be writing their software, or did you imagine that you would get Logic, Live, and all this software?
No, I knew that programs would gradually develop, and I knew that one day there'd be a plethora of very complicated programs. But why should I get Ableton Live? Not interested. My Cool Edit Pro does very simple editing. I don't even use convolution and things that are in that program, but I do use it for certain things like noise reduction and basic stuff like that. So basically, I've not ever felt the need. And if students have the need, then I try to help them and try to get them to help each other as well with programs that exist. Okay? Okay. Gosh.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.